brief recap of part of last week because I'd like to try to, if possible, even finish chapter 2 today. But where we left off in chapter 1 specifically was the area discussing what are known as the klipot. So klipot translate literally as shells or husk, I guess, technically speaking. And there's two categories of klipa. One is known as klipat noga, which translates literally as like a luminescent husk. In other words, it's somewhat translucent, I guess, for lack of a better term, where it doesn't completely obscure the godliness. And the other level of klipot are known as three klipot of impurity, which is basically a level of klipa of impurity that cannot be elevated. There's things that are absolutely forbidden based on Torah, receive their sustenance, if you will, through those three klipot of impurity, like that of, a non-kosher animal, pig, what have you, or other sins and the like. What is klipat noga? Klipat noga, which is the luminescent one, it acts sort of as a buffer or a median between the three klipot of impurity and holiness and sanctity. I don't have a board to draw this on, but if you just picture sanctity at the top, here, I can't see that on the screen. There we go. Sanctity at the top, klipat noga in the middle. That's an admixture of good and bad, good and evil. And at the bottom is the three klipot of impurity. So something that comes from this admixture, although it's predominantly bad, it's a klipa. It's basically concealing godliness, but notwithstanding, it has goodness within it as well, called the admixture of good and bad. So basically, the Jews' animal/vital soul emanates from this klipat noga, meaning that all of our base desires, for example, like that of eating, drinking, sleeping, procreating, exercising, all of your physical needs are driven by this particular animal soul, which comes from klipat noga. So, for example, eating, I think I gave the example last week. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that you love eating meat. You're one of those carnivorous type of peoples. Okay, so you might eat meat because you enjoy a steak, fine. And ultimately, why are you eating? You're eating because you need to be able to sustain yourself. And why do you have to sustain yourself? So you're able to serve God. You have energy. You can go daven, you can do a mitzvah, you can go to work to ultimately support your family and give tzedakah, etc. Or on the flip side, you can have somebody who's a glutton. Because they can't get enough of it. They're eating it like in a gluttonous way, not just to satiate themselves, but above and beyond the norm. It could be equated with that of wine. You can drink wine. Well, obviously you can drink it in a sanctified manner, kiddush or the like, but you can also drink wine like a drunkard. You just down a bottle, 2, 3, 4, what have you, and at that point, you're not elevating anything spiritually, because anything that comes from that admixture, that neighborhood of good and bad, of klipat noga, can either be elevated to holiness if used in a holy way, or conversely, at least temporarily, descend into the three klipot of impurity. Before I forget, I just want to thank Elise Iser for sponsoring tonight's class. So thank you very much, Elise Iser.
You're welcome.
And everybody here is thanking you as well.
Hey, can I see who's in the class?
You're looking, I don't look good enough? I guess not.
Oh, you do.
Right. You can take a quick look around. There we go. Everybody say hi. And you see him? Now you see him, now you don't. Okay, I'm back here. Okay, so that's sort of what we left off last week. And we mentioned how there are various character traits of ours that emanate from what's called the four elements: fire, water, earth, and air. Remember, for example, what trait would come from fire? Just so you remember anything. So large anger, for example, right? Your temper flares. It's an easy way to remember, right? Why do we say your temper flares? Because ultimately it goes up like that of fire. That's where the actual expression is in terms of every nuance and iota within time. Okay. And it's written in what are you talking back to me now? I don't understand. Hello. I'm not sure what went on here ever since I turned it around, but okay. Yeah, modern technology. So then we mentioned, this is where I left off last week. Left off that the Jewish, so the animal soul / vital soul within the Jew comes from klipas noga, this luminescent husk or luminescent shell, which has in it good as well. And it comes from what's called the secret, if you will, of the tree of good and evil. So why is it called the tree? This is in the Garden of Eden, right? In the beginning of Genesis. Why is it called the tree of good and evil? Because it's an admixture of good and evil. So ultimately, that's where, at least mystically speaking, this klipa receive its divine energy from. So it says, conversely, the souls of non-Jews or Gentiles, if you will, come from the three klipot of impurity, not from this sort of medium between the holy and the profane, if you will. And ultimately, they have no good in them whatsoever. I'm going to qualify this in just a minute before you get all jumpy. This is the end of chapter 1. And it says in the 8th Chaim, which is another Kabbalistic book, supported by the teachings of the Zohar, that all the good that the nations do, they do for themselves. As it says in some of the teachings of the Talmud, the kindness of the nations is, quote, sinful. It's a verse from Proverbs. And that according to Rabbi Gamliel, all the charity, can't read this without my glasses, sorry. All the charity and kindness done by the nations of the world is sinful to them, since they only do it to put on airs, etc. Now, this seems like a pretty sharp statement to say. What are you saying? That there's no such thing as a good non-Jewish person? Only Jews are good? Well, some Jews would like to believe that. Now, the Jews believe that that's not really true. Okay, and I know many of non-Jewish people are good, moral, ethical, nice people, kind, etc. So where does this all fit in? So, in short, remember, so I said the animal / vital soul that both Jews and non-Jews have come in from the Jew. Within the Jew, it comes from klipas naiga, this sort of intermediate, this luminescent, shell, if you will. The souls of non-Jews, of Gentiles, come from the three klipot of impurity, which ultimately is not an admixture of good and bad. It's evil. Now you're going to say, but it has to have some godliness in it. It couldn't exist otherwise. Nothing in this world can exist without godliness. And that's true. It does have godliness in it, albeit it's a much more diluted level of godliness where the godliness is not nearly as perceptible. Are there exceptions to the rule? The answer is yes. What are the exceptions? To whom does this not apply? So first and foremost, it does not apply to what are known as the righteous Gentiles of the world. So it says that the souls of the righteous Gentiles of the world receive their sustenance from klipas naiga, this admixture of good and evil. Those whose souls are not from there, those who do not observe, what does it mean to be a righteous Gentile? So it's often loosely used. For example, Schindler, they're using, he was one of the righteous Gentiles, or whoever it may be. But a righteous Gentile in Jewish law, in this context, is referencing specifically a person who fulfills the 7 Noahide commandments, 7 laws given to Noah and his sons, and fulfills them because God commanded them to be done. So what are the 7 laws? Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, idolatry, do not cause unnecessary harm to animals, do not blaspheme God's name, and set up like a judicial system. Those are roughly, and then there's offshoots from them. So even if a person does not murder, you say, well, I don't murder. But if you don't murder just because it doesn't feel good to you, not because God commanded you not to do so, means that you're not fulfilling it because God commanded you to do so. That's not under the purview of observing one of the 7 Noahide laws appropriately. The reason why we don't murder or commit adultery, etc., is because God told us not to do so. So someone who fits under that category is not inclusive in what I just mentioned over here. But the question is why? So why would the Alter Rebbe even say this? It's not a matter of sort of bolstering the uniqueness, of the Jew as opposed to sort of blaspheming the non-Jews. I mean, that's not going to make you popular. Even if let's say it's true, it's certainly not going to make you popular. So what is the Alter Rebbe getting at? So first and foremost, the premise behind the Alter Rebbe even discussing this is really not to, in a sense, demonstrate where the spiritual energy or the soul of the non-Jew comes from. It's a means, in a sense, of helping us understand the uniqueness specifically of the Jewish soul. Every day in davening, in the morning blessings, when one gets called to the Torah, we say, "Asher b'chabanu mikol amim," who chose us from amongst the nations. What does that mean? It means that God could have chosen anybody. Frankly speaking, there's a lot of people that were available to be chosen, but God didn't choose them for whatever reason it may be. And so we'll be on the previous class, go through all the details of the Medrash. It's fascinating, but won't get too far here. So in turn, because God chose us, let's say there's 1 million different people to choose from. I'll give you an analogy, all right? Let's say you're a farmer and you're planting seeds, okay? Now, if you want something to grow, you want to get the best seeds possible to ensure the greatest crop, the best crop, the healthiest crop, etc. So let's say, for argument's sake, you have 1 million different seats to look through, and the odds are that most of the seats are not going to be as good as the next. But you'll find within those million, maybe 50 good seeds, that are exceptionally good. And it's from those seeds that I grew this orchard. And now from those plants or trees that grew, I'm going to take their seeds and plant the next orchard. Basically you're kind of genetically designing things to be able to, I guess you call it survival of the fittest, I guess, according to some, right? But that's basically the objective. In essence, that's sort of what Hashem did when he gave us the 10 Commandments and chose us from amongst the nations of the world. There are many other people that existed, but God chose us to be that small nation. Numerically, we're not that big, to be chosen from amongst all the rest of them. And from there, and their progeny, and their progeny, going all the way down. What makes us unique? Not the fact necessarily that we have a neshama. Yes, we have a godly soul and neshama that a non-Jew doesn't have. But that our animal souls, which everybody has, the animal/vital soul that every human being has the potential to be used out for good. It's an admixture of good and evil. It's the way God created us to be. It's not a matter of like, I'm better than you. God created me a certain way. God created you a certain way. And I have a particular purpose to be done in this world, to do in this world. And you have a particular purpose to do in this world. And they're not interchangeable. So, for example, like a man may have a certain purpose in this world that cannot be done by a female, and vice versa, no matter what the world has to say today. Okay? And the same thing applies with a Jew and a non-Jew. It's not a matter of better or worse. It's a matter of what your purpose of creation is. And because you have a certain purpose to your creation, you need certain tools to enable you to fulfill your purpose of creation. And that's unique, in this particular case, unique to the Jew. So why is it, for example, that non-Jews, let's say, they do a lot of good things. They're charitable, they're philanthropic, they're nice people. Why are we saying that they're just doing this for their own boastfulness, etc.? So the answer is that the innate quality of a Jewish person, one of the things actually that overtly separates the Jew from a non-Jew, it says that we are Rahmanim, Baishan Nagem Chasadim. We are merciful people, and we are people who do acts of kindness, and we're humble, basically, or bashful. So if a Jew is missing those components that are innate, not that every Jew is super, kind, etc., but deep down we have it within ourselves. When push comes to shove, we start doing things that normally we wouldn't do. I mean, classic display would be what's going on in Israel today. You see people who had nothing to do with each other until October 7th or 8th. Okay, who wouldn't look each other in the face, Israelis, that is. And all of a sudden, everybody's helping each other, doing whatever they can to help out this one, that one. Doesn't matter what kind of hat you wear, don't wear it, observe it, non-observe it, it doesn't make a difference. Because deep down, we are who we are. Yes, we can argue till our faces turn blue. But ultimately, underneath that whole veneer of all the argument and all the, all the tzimmis, I guess, for lack of a better term, all right? Excitement going on, we're still these people the way God created us to be. The non-Jew, the Gentile specifically, I'm hitting the wrong buttons here, I don't know what I'm doing. Hope not. Okay. The Gentile, on the other hand, his soul is more of an egocentric type of soul. What does that mean? Egocentric means it's about me. Yes, I give. I'm philanthropic. I'm kind. I'm moral. I'm ethical. I. And even if they're not going to say it's I don't need my name on the wall. But I'm doing this because it's my world that I live in, and I want my world to be a better world, so therefore I'm doing A, B, C, or D. Again, it's your world. It's your this, whatever it may be. So while on one hand, yes, you got to commend them for what they're doing. You can't argue with the facts on the ground. But at the same time, it's not innate to them. That level of it being innate to them is something which is unique to you only because it's the way God created us. The packaging he gave us. It's already there and kind of putting it all together. Now, okay, I'll smack you next time. All right. Any questions before we get to chapter 2? Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to understand this. What about?
All right, chapter 2.
Biblically, okay, my understanding, to be wrong, is that the Christians that came from Jews, those that believed Jesus was the Christ, and they became Christians then, but they were originally Jews, so where did they fit in?
You're saying, why are all Christians not Jews today? Is that the question?
No.
What
What I'm saying is you're saying innate and Jewish, so it means it's
he was.
them,
There's no ambiguity as to the fact that he was born as a Jew.
Okay, so ancestrally, if you go back, then there are people out there who
are born as Jews, correct?
Okay, but they don't mean okay.
Well, there are plenty of people who today who are ancestrally, they're even halachically Jewish, don't even know they're Jewish themselves.
Right.
I meet them on a regular basis. I had no
Yeah.
idea, but my great grandmother, my mother's side is Jewish, and all of a sudden they
Right,
find they're
okay.
Jewish.
So, okay, so.
But
those people
it's
still
part
remain-
of your spiritual DNA. It's like,
Okay.
for example, there's a genetic code that comes down from your parents into your DNA, what have
Right.
you. You can't change that. It is what it is.
Okay, so I'm
It's the same concept here, that Hashem put your spiritual DNA into your soul in a certain way, and that's ultimately going to be inherited as the mother to your children, and so on and so forth. No matter what they do or don't do, it's always going to be part of their spiritual DNA.
Okay.
The spiritual DNA of a non-Jew's soul is different than that of the DNA of a Jew.
So even if.
It's not that they don't do nice things and good things. They
No, I get
do.
that.
Many of them do. But the point of the matter is, it's still there's a certain level of egocentrism, I guess, in there, that it's not to their fault. It's the way Hashem created them to be. I mean,
Right.
it's not that they're bad people, but God created them a certain way, to be a certain way for a certain reason. He created us to be different for a certain reason.
Okay.
That's basically where it boils down to.
Okay, so.
But the point behind the Alter Rebbe's whole little explanation here was essentially to bring out the uniqueness specifically of the Jew's animal/vital soul, where it's different. And we're gonna learn more about this. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg here. So, yes.
If I think she said it's like Paul, he married a Jewish woman, and he was originally a Jew. He would innately have his children would have a soul, and they would be Christian.
If Paul married a Jew, but if Paul married a non-Jew, then no. So obviously the original, Christians, if you want, or apostles, many of them were Jewish.
Right.
But they intermarried or married out with time, didn't take that. The original Christians kept Shabbos on Saturday, not on Sunday.
Right.
And they kept kosher and everything else. And bris milah, that slowly but surely kind of started to melt away. It's a little beyond, not really supposed to be in the class in Christianity. That's for Sunday. No, I understand.
Yeah, I was trying to understand.
But the point is, as long as there is, again, if the person is Jewish, that of matrilineal descent, that's according to Jewish law. So then the person is Jewish, no matter what happens, no matter what they did, didn't do, etc. It doesn't change that spiritual DNA. Certain things are going to change. We're going to see if I get to the end of chapter 2. It is going to describe to us how ultimately the actions of our parents, in particular, do have an effect on our spiritual lives. Okay, beyond the soul that we get, there's more to it. So hang tight. Any other questions before I move on to chapter 2? Okay, always has to be one. Always got to be one in the class. All right, chapter 2. So chapter 2 starts out with what's called the Nefesh Hashem Yisrael Chelek Elokam Imam. The second soul. The Alter Rebbe starts out. The second soul within the Jew is an actual part of God, and he uses the word actual in a very literal way. It's not figurative here. He's specific in using the word actual, meaning that we have an actual part of God within ourselves. It's not some sort of euphemistic thing or cutesy or feel good, whatever it is. What am I reading? So it says, when God, I'm supposed to be in front of the screen, sorry. When God, I need like one of those cameras on a boom, you know what I mean? When God gave Adam his soul, how did he implant his soul into Adam? He blew, it says literally, the words in the Bible, and he blew into him, he blew into his nostrils, a breath of life or a soul of life. So what is the uniqueness he blew into him? If you look at the rest of Genesis, for example, speaks about the 10 utterances by which the world was created. God said there should be light, and there was light. God said there should be vegetation, and there was vegetation. God said to this, etc. There's 10 different sayings in the beginning of Genesis. It doesn't say, and God said there should be a soul to Adam, and there was a soul to Adam. It doesn't say that. It says God blew, unique. Beyond it, God could have blown seeds into the ground. They made vegetation too, if you wanted to. I mean, it was open hunting. God could have done it any way he wanted. So what is unique about blowing a soul into Adam as opposed to God could have said, make a soul for Adam, and there was a soul for Adam? So the answer is that when a person blows with force, let's say you're blowing up one of those, you remember those big punching bag balloon things, that take all the kaichas out of you? You get gas, and then they let the air out and they bring it back to you, blow it up again, so you get dizzy. Okay, they take a lot of energy, right? Why does it take energy? Because when a person blows hard, they're blowing from their core. So your core literally coming from your kishkas, so to speak, your very core itself. When a person speaks words like the 10 utterances, again, this is an anthropomorphic statement because God is not physically limited or a physical human being, but nonetheless. So when you speak, generally speaking, you can speak for a long time without getting very tired. Each word doesn't take a tremendous amount of energy and out of a healthy person. But blowing hard does. Why? Because it's coming from your core essence. So what it's saying is that when God blew a soul into Adam, he blew it from his core essence, from God's core essence. That's what made up the neshama, the soul of Adam. Pretty intense. Okay. Got that? Question from the audience.
Adam is before Jude. Adam is the progenitor of all people.
Correct.
And he has God's essence.
Yes. So it says when God gave Adam a soul, Adam acted as what's called an neshama klali, as a sort of a general soul, well, for all of mankind, but specifically for all the Jewish people. That all of our souls to have been created, whatever, thousands of years later, were somehow all inclusive within Adam's soul itself. As opposed to just being a unique soul only for Adam, he had what's called a neshama, like a general soul for all of us. It says when we get too sidetracked, but God, when he created the world, he created 600,000 general souls, which all ultimately emanate through Adam. Okay, but in general, amongst the Jewish people, God created 600,000 Jewish souls, and each one of those 600,000 are subdivided into another 600,000, which means that there are 600,000 to the 600,000th Jewish souls that exist throughout the whole world. Okay, historically as well. I don't know what the number is, but it's a lot. Okay. We're diluted, yes, to a degree. We'll see shortly, even though we might be of a soul, of another reincarnation, etc., we're going to see momentarily that we all ultimately connect to exactly the same spot, which is the core essence of God. So even though, yeah, it may be a long chain, but if you tug like any long chain, no matter how long the rope may be, if you go like this at the bottom, it's a matter of time until it hits the top, because it's all one long continuum. And it's the same thing with our souls. So it says that when it comes to the Jewish people's souls, it says that God, our souls ultimately come from God's brain, if you will, for lack of a better term. Again, these are anthropomorphic statements. God is not a physical human being. He doesn't have a physical brain. But we use human terminology to help give us some understanding. We quoted these verses last week where it says God calls us his firstborn son, right? Or you are children to the Lord your God. So we're children, we're like sons. So in essence, just like it says that a son is drawn down from the brain of his father, so too does the soul of every Jewish person come down from God's wisdom and God's intellect. Okay, so let me just qualify that. What does it mean that we come from the brain of our father? So it's not talking about it in the physical sense, although it's interesting. There was a medieval scientific, I don't know if it's a theory or what have you, that came to the understanding somehow the drop of semen that a father helps to produce a child even ultimately comes, albeit in a bit of an ethereal way, from the brain itself. It starts in the brain and slowly but surely coarsens as it comes through the rest of the body until it's made into actual physical semen. There's such a medieval scientific notion, and that's perhaps where the Alter Rebbe got this analogy from. But nonetheless, even on a more spiritual level, everything ultimately in the body is dictated to by the brain. Correct? So we can do a lot of transplants in modern day science today. We cannot have yet to figure out how to transplant the brain. Correct? That they do hearts, basically all the rest of the kishkas. Brains, basically, it controls everything. If there'll ever come to be the ability, I don't know. I'm not a neurologist, but my understanding is it's fairly complicated. Okay? So when we talk about coming from God's intellect, God's brain, God's head, what is that supposed to mean? That we come from, when we speak about God's wisdom, is it a wisdom that we can understand? The answer is no. The Hebrew word for a wise person is, anybody know what the Hebrew word is? Chacham, exactly, like we say in the Haggadah. A chacham. Chachma means wisdom. So God's wisdom is a wisdom that we can't understand. It's beyond us. God is infinite and we are finite. And ultimately, he brings down here from the Rambam that God is the knower, God is the knowledge, and God is the I guess the knower, and the knowledge. Meaning that when it comes to human being, let's say you open up a book, you're studying calculus, for argument's sake, whatever it may be, and you may have mastered calculus, but still in all, are you the calculus? Is calculus you? The answer is no. You're you, and the calculus is a subject matter that somehow either is absorbed in your life or not, but it's not you. It's not who you are. You're not the calculus itself. You didn't write the calculus either, for that matter. It's not like you're the author of it. And you happen to be the in this case, the person who's the consumer. With Hashem, Hashem is all three of them. God is the one who wrote the book, wrote the knowledge. God is the knowledge. God is the knower. He's all the aforementioned, and in the words of the Rambam, and ultimately it's something which we can't understand. That's what he writes. It's not, this idea is not physically understandable, because we as human beings can only understand things that we can equate something else in our life experience to, or something in the world to. There is nothing else in the world that mirrors this ability of God. So therefore we can't truly comprehend what that actually means, but so writes the Rambam. And then he writes, he asks basically like a rhetorical question from the book of Job. Says, can you find God by searching? Meaning, is there any way to understand God? The answer is no. So don't bother. Another verse he brings down from Isaiah, it says, God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways, etc. So meaning that we can bang our heads against the wall as long as we want to try to figure out why. It's usually not a good place to go to. We call this in English an exercise in futility, because you can't. We as human beings are not capable of understanding God's wisdom, and trying to understand it is just going to literally just make you crazy, make you anxious for no reason. Now, even though when it comes to souls, so let's just say, okay, all of our soul, let's say here's God's brain. I'm going to use my, this is my imaginary brain up. You see it? Okay, gray matter. Okay. So here's God's brain, and every soul now comes from this God's brain. Like every child ultimately in some way, shape, or form descends from the genetic makeup of the father's brain. So the same thing with God. Now the question is, are all souls equal? You asked before, okay, so yeah, you have souls that come, from this generation, that generation, 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later. Was Moses' soul like my soul? Was my soul like Moses' soul or not? Or am I completely different league? Where does that put us? So he says that even though there are myriads, tens of thousands, okay, literally, of levels within souls, one higher than the next, frankly speaking, almost like an infinite amount of levels of souls. So what would be, for example, the apex, the highest level, spiritual level, that is, of souls? Who would you pin as being a person who has an extremely high spiritual soul? You can keep me out of it, it's fine. Just out of humility, honestly. Let's say historically, Moses, exactly, good example. Anyone else comes to mind? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, they are great patriarchs, matriarchs, the greats. So their souls obviously came from a very high place. Fine. But where does that put us? Relative to Moses, it's not even the same chart. You would think we're not even remotely close. So if that's the case, when we all come from that same place, Moses come from, I come from, on my hand, it's great, but I don't know how he feels about this. I kind of bring down bar, really, far low. So he says that ultimately every single soul, from the souls of Moses and the patriarchs and matriarchs, down to the Kal Shebekalim. Kal Shebekalim translates, how does he translate literally here? It means like the lowest of low. If I can read this, it'd be helpful. Kal Shebekalim. I know he translates it. It's here someplace. Whatever. Bottom line is, it means the lowest of human beings, like the lowest of low, the bottom of the barrel. We all ultimately come from what's called the supernal wisdom of God. So all of us come from the same spot. Now, granted, there's more concealment between here and my soul, and as opposed to here and Moses' soul or Abraham's soul, etc. But ultimately, that line, that chain goes straight up to the top, to every single one of us. So what ends up happening? So for example, when you have a union between a husband and wife, right? So the husband implants in the wife a drop of semen, and then it sits in her for 9 months, and ultimately child pops out, right? So some people say, well, it's it's science, it's normal, it's natural, whatever. Call it what you want, but it's a little hard to deny that every child born is like a miracle unto itself. How it all lines up out of what seems to be little matter is an absolute wonder, just on a scientific level. But leave that out. The fact that the drop goes into the mother for 9 months, okay, and then this child is formed, meaning from the highest level of that child, which is the brain, right? Not just spiritually, but even physically speaking, to the lowest level of life within that child, external level of life, which would be what on the body? What part of the body has the lowest obvious level of life, where if you cut it, it doesn't hurt? Your toenails, exactly. The bottom of your body and your nail, even though they're alive because they grow, but even that comes from exactly the same spot. They all come from that same drop, whether it's the brain or the lowest level of living in that body, lowest level of vitality, which is the toenails, all come from exactly the same spot, which ultimately is the father's brain going back. So too does it apply with our souls and that of God. You could be the brain of the Jewish people, in case you happen to think of yourself as Moses, maybe you have a Moses-esque type of personality, or the patriarchs and matriarchs, even if you're not there. And even if we're at the bottom of the barrel, we all come from exactly that same spot. So, and he says that not only do we come from the same spot, we're actually sustained from that drop, which ultimately came from the brain. He said, but I'm an independent person. That's true. Once a child's born, they're no longer physically attached to their mother, correct? Child's born, they're their own independent human being. Now, granted, there's always a relationship, and we may be similar blood types or dissimilar or whatever it may be, and certain character traits, and the dimples came, it didn't come, whatever it is. But beyond all that, as exists within the physical DNA of a human being, we all have DNA from our parents in us, correct? Same thing applies to the spiritual DNA. So at least spiritually, we all came from our father's brain at some point, and then it came down to this drop, ultimately into your mother's womb for 9 months. So there's always going to be this connection to that spiritual DNA, even though we're independent people. But I'm still carrying some of that spiritual DNA, and so will my children carry this spiritual DNA and the next generation down, etc., etc. So he says, and he brings this down from the Talmud. It says, it says that the white, literally is the way it translates it, in the white seed of the father from which tendons, bones, and nails are formed. I'm not sure if scientifically that's accurate or not. I have no idea, but at least on a spiritual level, that's where it comes from. So it's explained that the nails Kabbalistically are equated with what was called like the nail-like substance that Adam was covered with in the Garden of Eden. So it's true they didn't wear clothes until they sinned, until they realized, right? They or fig leaf, whatever book you read when you were younger. Okay, but it says that in Kabbalah it mentions that Adam was covered in a nail-like substance, like keratin, I guess. That's what nails are made out of. And then spiritually speaking, that has very deep significance based on Kabbalah, which is beyond my understanding, so I can't explain it to you. But if you want to look it up, it's an Eitz Chaim, which is tomorrow's course. Okay, so but point of the matter is that the nails, again, which is the lowest level of vitality within the body, still comes from a place called Moach Tfuna. Moach Tfuna translates literally as nourished from mental energy. In other words, that the point is that there's a direct connection between the nails and the brain, mental energy, even with that of Adam and being covered in the nail-like, substance, etc. So the same thing applies with, figuratively speaking, with every single Jewish soul. Every one of us, I don't know if you remember this from last week, but how many levels are there to the Jewish soul in general? 5 is correct, okay? So the lowest level is nefesh, translates as vital soul, or the animal soul. Ruach, spirit, literally. Neshama, which is a word I'm sure many of you have heard of. Where does the word neshama come from? Any idea? Exactly. Neshama means a breath. God blew a soul into Adam. So the word neshama etymologically is from the same word as neshama. And then 2 higher levels of the soul, which are not manifest in the body, kol chai and yechida. These are like the higher spiritual levels of your soul, which remain suspended above although connected to you, but it's kind of the source of your mazel, of other blessings that don't necessarily make their way down to the physical. They remain suspended on high. But every one of our nefesh, ruach, neshama, let's say for argument's sake, there's 15 million Jews, whatever the number may be today. Every one of us has a nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, and chira. Every one of our nefashot, just the level of nefesh, has within it many, many different levels. Every one of our ruachs, level of ruach, is also many different levels. Every one of our neshamas are many different levels, meaning that you can have 10 people sitting in a room and collectively have 1,000 different levels spiritually within them. Although some of them are very subtle and may not be perceptive to us, because we're not soul doctors that can see exactly what level of nefesh you have, or ruach you have, or neshama you have, but they're there. And they all differ one from the next. But ultimately, even though there are myriads and myriads, tens and hundreds of thousands of levels amongst all these different souls, depending on where they, it's a lot easier with a blackboard, depending on where they came from spiritually, as they came down from God's brain, they went through various spiritual concealments, okay, until they came into our bodies, some more concealed, some less concealed, but nonetheless, we all, as concealed as it may be, as we may be, we still ultimately attach to the top. Anybody familiar with the four spiritual worlds of Atzilut, Bria, Tzir, and Asiya? Some of you are. I gotta get a blackboard to do this next time. Okay, so basically just for practical purposes, this is practical, Tanya. There are four spiritual, these are not physical planets. Okay, just envision four spiritual worlds. There are four spiritual levels. Okay, the highest being that of Atzilos, the world of emanation, followed by the world of creation, Bria, followed by the world of formation, and followed by the world of action, which is the world we live in. These are spiritual worlds. Each one of them have various levels within them. So if you picture the top world, and it has essentially 10 components to it, and as you go down from one level to the next level, the godliness within it becomes more and more concealed. You can picture like, they have those big lights, they advertise movies, you know what they call those huge spotlights. Okay, so I don't know how many lumens they are, or candle lights, thousands, whatever they may be. Now, you can't look straight into one, you'll blind yourself. But if, on the other hand, if you took, for example, a black shmata, tablecloth like this, and you threw it over one of them, now it might burn it because they're probably so hot, but nonetheless, you put enough of them on it, you're eventually going to be able to dilute that level of light until it becomes something which is palatable for your eyes to be able to handle. So it's like having like a colored lens in front of a light, whatever it may be. So does it change the light? No, the light's exactly the same light. The difference is there's many different levels of concealment above it to make it something more palatable, whatever the level of light may be. So too, in a sense, when it comes to godliness, let's imagine pure, unadulterated godliness up here. It's too intense to come down and be manifest in anything, even spiritual, let alone physical. Because there are many spiritual levels between God and us, the physical, corporeal world we live in here today. So therefore, the godliness has to be concealed, and more concealment, and more concealment. It's called the process of tzimtzum. Literally is the term that's used, which means contractions, like it's narrowed down more and more and more, until finally, God is found in this bottle of water. You say, well, God's in here? It says crystal geyser, or geyser, depending how old you are, okay? The answer is yes. Even God is found even in this bottle of water, but I don't see God in this bottle of water. That's right, because godliness has been so concealed that by the time it comes down to here, it looks like a plastic bottle that has water in it to me, and that's it. Now, granted, it might be sustaining me and you and whatever it may be. God's in this lectern. God's in everything that we see. But it's after thousands and thousands, in the sense of levels of concealment, to enable the godliness to be manifest in what we perceive as the physical realm. The same concept applies in the spiritual world. There's a level of unadulterated godliness which is too poignant, too intense to come down and even manifest within a spiritual level. It also has to be concealed first before it can come down into some spiritual world. So it goes through various processes of concealment and then goes to the next world, the world of creation. And then there's the various levels of concealment there, and it goes down to the world of formation. Again, more levels of concealment until finally it comes down to the world of action, the world of Asiya, the world we live in. Again, at the bottom of the barrel, and now you have the physical, where godliness is everywhere. The difference is it's so concealed, we don't necessarily see it unless we're digging for it. That's kind of the gist of that. One day I'll actually be able to draw it out so I can give you a little better idea. Okay, but going back to the actual text itself. So what the Alter Rebbe is getting at is that every single soul, from the highest of high to the souls of what's called the Amei Haaretz. Amei Haaretz literally mean like the commoners, people who are ignorant of Torah. Okay, Amei Haaretz or Pchutei Ha'erech means people of lesser value. Not as people who are more boorish in nature. They're not cultured people, but nonetheless, they, every single one of them, from the bottom all the way to the top, have what he calls here in the Hebrew. He says, "Kushartim yuchedet biyichud nifla, ba'atzim b'mehusma atzmutzim rishim shashem shachs fakrilah." We have a wondrous bond between our souls, no matter who we are, no matter where we are in the pecking order, with the very top itself, which is God's supernal wisdom, the core essence of God, the brain of God. So like the brain is the highest level within the human being and sustains the entire body, so too with God, the brain of God, for lack of a better term, is sort of like the core essence of God. And it's from there that every single soul, no matter who you are, ultimately connects directly to, with a wondrous bond, meaning it's not some sort of like far off, God said, oh, I need a couple more souls. There's some more souls, I don't know where they went. Oh, there's one. Pick that one up. Every one of them has an amazing bond with God. As distant as a person may seem and or feel from godliness, that bond is always going to be there. As I think I mentioned last week, the Jews make lousy atheists. We're just not good at it. We are self-proclaimed atheists, agnostics, atheists. We choose something, and either we created it or we're part of it, okay, or some other ism. But we're really not good at it. The old saying is, there are no atheists in foxholes. As soon as the shooting starts, you start praying. Where are you praying to? Well, at that point, you start praying to God. I don't care what you believe, didn't believe. Right now, I believe. There's no place else to go. So as long as it's convenient, we can be atheists or agnostics or whatever it is, or half believe in some other, whatever being it may be. As long as the word is not God, I'm okay. Okay, but deep down, our spiritual DNA gives us that connection to Hashem that no matter what comes, no matter what happens, it can never be broken. It's a wondrous bond. We'll learn a little later on. Basically, it's an inexorable bond. It's a bond that can't be broken. It says even, it's not brought down in this chapter, but even if, God forbid, a person converts out of Judaism to another religion, according to Jewish law, you're born Jewish, you die Jewish, irrespective of what other ism they may have joined or not in between. And there's plenty of Boo Jews and other kind of Jews and what have you. Sadly, I should say, because invariably the Jew by nature is a spiritual being who's seeking spirituality. And sadly, as is the case with many of us, our upbringing in Judaism was rather bland and didn't give us much spiritual nourishment. It was like a lot of do's and don'ts and boring rituals. So therefore, I found some other ism that's exciting, and therefore, whatever, the Swami Baba Ganush I mentioned throughout last week, in Nepal, what have you, and I found love and meaning and whatever else it is. Okay. Okay, so so you come to Chabad, that we have Lubavitcher Rebbe, you've heard the Rebbe, speak about the Rebbe, etc. What is this fascination with the Rebbe? I'm sure he was a great man. He was a great man. I had the pleasure of meeting him. He was a bright man, very enigmatic character, had character traits, etc. Beyond the pale of your normal human being. But why the fascination? Why is it constant Rebbe, 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 Rebbe? What's this like connection that a chassid seems to have with the Rebbe that doesn't go away? I have a tendency to go to New York periodically. Just one of those things, like a knee-jerk reaction. Been on the ground too long, I have to go back. Well, I go to New York, usually my first stop, then I go to wherever I gotta go. Okay? Why? I can pray. If I want to connect to the Rebbe, I can do it here. I don't have to go to his gravesite necessarily. All true. But nonetheless, there's this bond that seems to be like, some people call it obsessive. Where does that come from? So there's a verse that says, Uladov Kabai, which means, it's a saying of our sages of blessed memory, to connect to him, to cling to him, literally is what it means. How do I cling to God? God is not physical. I'm a physical human being who has physical hands and feet. How do I cling to something that I can't see and I can't feel and I don't necessarily always hear? So the answer is, the sages tell us, it says somebody who clings to a Torah scholar is as though they are clinging to the actual divine presence itself. So it says, why? Because somebody who clings to these Torah scholars, the greats, you are binding your nefesh, ruach, neshama, those three levels of your soul, your primal soul, your vital soul, your spirit, your neshama, to the nefesh, ruach, neshama of that tzaddik, of that righteous person, of that great scholar. So you're creating this bond between the two of you, because that's a physical person. And I can physically study the teachings of that scholar. I can physically be impressed with whatever, levels of instruction they give me or whatever it may be. And therefore, the more I cling to them, the more I am clinging, quote unquote, to God himself. So you're not allowed to worship the human being. You're not worshiping them. On the contrary, what you're doing is you're creating the spiritual bond between your nefesh, ruach, neshama with the nefesh, ruach, neshama of that tzaddik, of that great scholar, who connects directly up to God. So I can understand clinging to a great spiritual person. Who wouldn't want to? If you had an opportunity, it's like the answers to all of life's quests are in those teachings, then why not? Hey, I'm in. It makes my life a lot easier. So the more I cling to that, the greater my connection is ultimately to God himself, to God's supernal wisdom, to whom the tzaddik the righteous person has a greater appreciation than I do. They understand this much better than I do. But by my connecting to that person, I'm automatically connecting now to a much higher level. Okay, that sounds good. How about those who are rebels? Someone who's not really interested in connecting. The rebels amongst the Jewish people. Those who intentionally rebel against everything that's sacred. Do they also receive their divine sustenance from God? Do their souls also get their divine energy from this supernal wisdom of God? And since they're probably not connecting themselves to the tzaddik, the righteous person of the generation, then where are they getting their, clinging from? So the answer is, it says that they get it from B'chias HaCharayim Shel Nefesh Ruach Neshama Tamid Chachamim. They get it from what's literally translated as the hind side, if you will, the back, behind, so to speak, of the Nefesh Ruach Neshama of the tzaddik. What does that mean? He says, in general, when a person wants to give somebody something, so the appropriate way to give them a gift, whatever it may be, is to hand it to them, right? You don't throw it to them, throw it at them. On the other hand, if you want to give something to your enemy and come to get lost, you're not going to make a whole formal presentation. It's like throw it over your back and get out of here, that type of thing. So to speak, in essence, the divine energy that these rebels, people who intentionally rebel against God, they get their energy from where? Like the hind side. Again, it's not a physical side, but the hind side, spiritual side of the nefesh, ruach neshama of the righteous people of that generation. They still get it through them. That's how they're clinging some way or another to God, albeit it's coming from a more diluted, if you put it, or concealed level of godliness, but it's still there. So now you ask me, I mentioned this, I think, towards the beginning of the class, about since all of our souls ultimately come from God, even though we're on very different levels, some people higher, lower, tens of thousands of levels amongst the Jewish people or more. So we don't get to choose what soul we get. It's not like once the child is formed or being formed, God brings out a book. Okay, let's see, we have these souls available today and they're on sale. They didn't get an option. Okay, it's not like you get to choose. The parents don't get to choose either. Whatever soul God decides the person is going to get is what they get. So if that's the case, do the parents have any influence whatsoever on the spiritual DNA, so to speak, of the child? So the Alter Rebbe writes, okay, so it says that what's key is that the parents of this child to be sanctify themselves while they are intimate with each other. In other words, that they're having intimacy, albeit in a more spiritual way. It doesn't mean that person cannot physically enjoy the intimacy. You can, you're supposed to, etc. But on the other hand, there's a premise. You're not like two animals, for you pardon the expression, who are just doing whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want, etc. Things are done in a more modest way. So a person should sanctify themselves during that time period Unlike those who are, let's say, less cultured people, or the more uncouth type of people who just do whatever they want, wherever they want. Why? Why does it matter? Why does it matter to the kid? I mean, the parents want to do what they want to do, fine. So either they're good, they're more moral, they're immoral. What does that have to do with the child to be born? So it says that there's no nefesh, ruach, and neshama, no soul, ultimately, or levels of souls that don't have what's called a levush. Levush translates as a garment. What does a garment mean? A garment means that the soul, again, is a spiritual entity. So when the soul comes down to the body, it can't do anything without a vehicle to express itself. In other words, the soul in and of itself can't do any mitzvah, can't serve God because it doesn't have any tools, doesn't have any garments. The garments that are referred to over here are, I mentioned also last week, machshava dibur ma'aseh, thought, speech, and action, which we'll get more into the next chapter or two. So our thought, speech, and action are our levushim, our garments. The sanctity of those garments of that child to be is dictated by the actions of the parents. So that when the parents sanctify themselves appropriately while they're intimate, and that child is born of that union, so therefore they can bring down a holy levush, holy garment, if you will, to that child. The soul itself is up to God. But the soul without the garment can't do much. It needs those garments. So he says that even beyond the garments itself, all the mitzvahs that a person does, what these garments do, all the mitzvahs that you do, the spiritual energy derived from or given to those mitzvahs comes down through these garments. These are like your tools to make everything happen. And not only that, it says all the shefa, all the divine influence that a person gets from heaven comes down through those garments. So like anything else, the cleaner, the purer the garments are, the greater the connectivity between our soul and God. The more sullied, if you will, or dirtied the garments are, the more difficult that relationship is going to be. The soul is still the soul. That didn't change. But the soul's ability to react and interact is going to be more difficult. It's more compromised that way. So it says that if a person sanctifies himself during intimacy, so then they draw down a holy garment to their child. Even if the child has a very holy soul, again, we don't get to choose our souls. So some people get a soul that came from a very high place, the person, let's say, who they're reincarnated from, were extremely righteous and holy people, and other people don't. But even getting that very holy soul doesn't guarantee that child's going to have a holy garment. So that holy soul, if they're given more of a sullied garment because their parents didn't act accordingly, it would make it difficult even for that holy soul to interact properly with God and get all of its divine influences that are necessary to sustain it. So it says at times it's possible that you can have a very, very high level soul, if you will, come and be drawn down to the child of almost like a despicable person. The parents might be like, the bottom of the barrel. But nonetheless, the kid warranted to have this very holy soul. It happens. He doesn't bring it down over here in the Tanya itself, but an example would be of Rabbi Meir. If you study a little bit of the Talmud or the Mishnah, Rabbi Meir is constantly mentioned, where there's no name attached to a particular saying in the Mishnah, it says that came from Rabbi Meir. He's that prominent. Who is Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir actually came from a family of Romans originally. They were converts. Romans were not good friends with the Jews going back in the day. But that's what his yichus, you talk about having good pedigree. His yichus was he came from the Romans. Not something you want to advertise necessarily on a shidduch, on a profile if you're looking to get married. But not only that, so the sages tell us that his actual soul was a reincarnation of Esav. Who is Esav? That was the twin brother of Jacob, okay? Who ultimately was the father, if you will, of Christianity, going back. It says that Christianity ultimately stemmed from Esav, albeit many generations later. But that's where this famous Rabbi Meir came from. The holy Rabbi Meir came from a pedigree, let's just say, that was less than luster. But nonetheless, he obviously was a very humble and prominent and intensely spiritual person. Maybe his garments were, I don't know who his parents were, but were great. And ultimately he succeeded above and beyond the norm for many, that many others could not. So other examples would be King David. He came from Ruth, who was a convert. There's many in Jewish history that didn't come. Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, also a convert, okay, who came He was 40 years old. He didn't know an aleph from a bet. He became one of the greatest teachers in Jewish history for over thousands of years. And there are many others who didn't come from a very high soul. Their soul was not from a very high place, but nonetheless, they were able to succeed far and beyond the norm. So just to wrap this up, it's kind of the conclusion of chapter 2-ish. I didn't do all this inside, but you got the basic idea that invariably, just to go back to the beginning of chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe started discussing what's called the second soul in the Jewish person. Why is it called the second soul? Would you not think that the godly soul should be the first soul? And then we'll discuss the animal soul as the second soul. That kind of just in the order of things, what's primary, what's secondary? So the answer is no. The Alter Rebbe in the first chapter discusses the animal/vital soul. Why? Because you need the animal/vital soul to allow the body to exist. If there's no body, then the godly soul has nothing to go into. There's no vehicle, there's no vessel for it to go into. So that has to come in first. And only thereafter does the godly soul come into the person. It's interesting to note that the godly soul actually comes into a person in stages. It doesn't come in one day. We actually had a bris in shul here earlier today. So it's the shul's got organized, and we went about 4 times already. The service this morning was set up one way and the bris another way, and now Baruch Hashem. So what happens at a bris for a boy in particular? It says that a part of his godly soul comes into his body at his bris. Part of it's at birth. We all get part of it at birth. But for a boy in particular, it comes in at his bris, and then the sum total of his godly soul comes in at his bar mitzvah, and for a girl at her bat mitzvah. That's when they're bona fide with full-blown godly and animal/vital soul. But it's second. It comes in second because it's the vital animal soul that has to sustain the body, that keeps us going, keeps us alive. And now it's the godly soul that slowly but surely is fighting against it. Just to summarize, why do we even need to have a godly soul? What's the purpose of having a godly soul? The godly soul, we said at the beginning of the chapter, is an actual part of God, which means since God is perfect, God doesn't need me to perfect the part of him in me, right? I mean, what am I going to do to perfect what's already perfect? Correct? Good question. I didn't make it up. Okay. So the answer is that the godly soul is placed into us to help perfect, so to speak, the animal/vital soul that we have, which is not perfect. Maybe present company excluded, some of them in particular, but it's not perfect. And therefore, it's a lifetime of work and more to try to, in a sense, live a proper lifestyle as we should. What enables us to overcome our lusts and passions, things that we shouldn't be doing, is the godly soul that God put in us. And what gives it the oomph, the power to do so, going back to the beginning of chapter 1, remember those oaths that we took before the soul came down to the body? It is made to take an oath that it will be righteous, a tzaddik, and not a rasha, not a wicked person. Even though the odds of that happening are not high, but nonetheless, the fact we utter those words that we're going to be tzaddik, righteous, and not rasha, that gives the soul, the godly soul, the ability to wage war with the animal soul on a daily basis, and thus help to transform its desires and its passions, which could be like parv, coming from that neutral klipa, klipat noga, the luminescent klipa, but elevate them to holiness, so that when I eat and when I drink, when I sleep, when I procreate, etc., they're all done with the intent of serving Hashem, and not just to satisfy my own carnal desires, etc. That, in essence, sort of wraps up chapter 2. I want to thank you all for joining us. Next week, as mentioned, I am out of town, but we'll follow up with Hashem the following week. So, and then it's recorded as well. So I'm supposed to be careful what I say, because, once it's recorded, you never know where it goes. All right. Have yourselves a fine Thursday and a Shabbat Shalom. Okay, all you Zoomites.
Bye.
Folks,
Thank you, Rabbi.
you're welcome.
All right.
I do this as a button here someplace, and